So, the nominations for the 92nd Academy Awards were announced a week ago, and in what has become an annual tradition, people complain about who was snubbed. I'm never 100% happy with the list of nominees, and I don't think I'm ever going to be, so I've decided that I don't really care anymore. Even though I really wanted Lupita Nyong'o to be nominated for giving not one, but two great performances in Us, after how Toni Collette was ignored despite her unreal performance in Hereditary, my expectations were on the floor and the Academy met them. But one thing did catch me by surprise, and not necessarily in a bad way, and that is the omission of Frozen 2 in the Best Animated Feature category. I'm not going to call it a snub because snub implies that I think it should have been nominated, which I don't. I'm actually extremely happy with this list of nominees, and if you're a big fan of Frozen 2, before you get angry, just hear me out. This video is by no means about hating the movie because I don't. It is more about my disappointment in what could have been and how tweaking the movie could have earned it its spot on this year's Oscars list. First, let's talk about Walt Disney Animation Studios and how they've performed at the Oscars. Not to be conflated with Disney as a whole, as in the giant corporation with many branches that will soon own everything. I'm talking about the animation studio, the one that made Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in 1937, followed by Pinocchio, Fantasia, Dumbo, Bambi, 58 films all the way to Frozen 2 in 2019. So while a win for a Pixar movie, for example, is also a win for Disney, the corporation, as a whole, because they own Pixar, it's not a win for Walt Disney Animation Studios because it's not their movie. The Academy Award for Best Animated Feature was introduced in 2002 for movies made in 2001. Before this, Disney broke a major barrier with Beauty and the Beast getting nominated for Best Picture, and is still one of only 3 movies to get nominated in that category. But it wasn't until 2002 where animated movies were guaranteed an Oscar by the inclusion of this new category. For that first decade, Walt Disney Animation Studios had no luck. Atlantis, the first movie to be eligible for the award, was not nominated. Lilo and Stitch and Treasure Planet were both nominated but lost to Spirited Away. Brother Bear was nominated but lost to Finding Nemo. Home on the Range, Chicken Little, and Meet the Robinsons were not nominated. Bolt was but lost to Wall-E. The Princess and the Frog was but lost to Up. 9 movies, 5 nominations, 0 wins. And even though I love some of these, the fact of the matter is they lost to better movies. Disney was in its post-Renaissance era. Following a decade where they released classic after classic after classic, they were now releasing box office and critical duds. This was due to them seeing the massive success of the Shrek movies and everything Pixar released, and drawing the conclusion that public taste in animation had changed, so they tried to change along with it. But everything they released was overshadowed by other animation studios doing it better. But the end of the decade spelled something promising for Disney Animation. They returned to their roots, releasing their first princess movie in 11 years with The Princess and the Frog. We didn't know it at the time, but this was the start of the revival era. What would be a string of critical and commercial successes for the studio. In 2010, Tangled was a critical success and became the highest grossing movie the studio released since The Lion King in 1994. Winnie the Pooh was the best reviewed animated movie of 2011. What is extremely puzzling and kind of infuriating is that neither of them were nominated for the Oscar. Still makes no sense to me, but it's okay. They kept pushing, and in the following year they released another success with Wreck-It Ralph, which was nominated but lost to Brave. I strongly believe that this was the first Pixar movie that didn't deserve the win. It should have gone to Wreck-It Ralph. Not that Brave is bad, but I'll elaborate on my issues with it in a minute. But essentially at this point, Pixar's brand was so strong. They had already won 6 Oscars in this category compared to Disney, which still had 0. That is until the following year, where a little movie came out. You might have heard of it. It's called Frozen. One of my biggest pet peeves is when a movie becomes so astronomically popular that undeserved backlash against it starts to kick in. A sort of recent example that made me the most angry was La La Land. There's just no way this movie would have gotten even half of the hate that started to happen had it not been nominated for a record-tying 17 Oscars. And it happened with Frozen as well. At the time, it was the 5th highest grossing movie of all time, and by far the highest grossing animated movie ever, beating Toy Story 3 by over 200 million. There was no escaping not only Let It Go, but the entire soundtrack everywhere you went. There was no escaping the merchandise. Frozen was everywhere. And I get that that became annoying very fast, but let's just put all of that aside and go back to November 2013 when this movie just came out and we had no idea what it would become. Frozen blew me away when I saw it, and it completely took me by surprise. First and foremost, that's because the lead up to it, the trailers, the marketing campaign, really didn't give any indication that this was going to be different, that Disney Animation for the first time was going to play around with its tropes, poke fun at itself, and try something new. I always compare it to Brave, where it was the complete opposite experience. Pixar really drove home the idea that this is not your ordinary princess. She's fierce and inelegant, she doesn't want to get married, she rides through the woods on horseback with a bow and arrow. The buzz was that this was the groundbreaking movie that would subvert what we knew animated princess movies to be. But instead what we got was not only pretty conventional but also uninteresting. Mulan accomplished so much more in the portrayal of a fierce, inelegant tomboy than Brave did, and just because Mulan ended up with a male love interest at the end doesn't change that. But more importantly, Merida isn't made interesting just by the idea that she doesn't want to get married and all she wants to do is ride her horse. And that's where Pixar went wrong. She is, in my opinion, by far the most boring princess of recent times. She had no growth other than realizing her mother wasn't so bad, but considering her mother was a bear that couldn't communicate well for a lot of the movie, what could have been a compelling narrative on a mother-daughter relationship wasn't explored nearly as much as it should have been. And Merida's arc, if there even is one, isn't very compelling, because there isn't that deep desire to do something. So while the princess that came before her, Tiana, might be in a more traditional princess tale, it's still far more compelling because she's a fleshed out character with not only a deep desire to build a successful life for herself and her mother, but also the strong determination and drive to work her butt off to accomplish it. While Brave presented itself as a subversion that turned out to be a pretty basic story, Frozen, on the other hand, presented itself as a conventional princess animation that turned into a subversion. I loved that. They still kept a lot of their usual formula that always works well, like the dead parents and the I Want song, but they made pretty big changes and not just in a basic cookie cutter way. They did it thoughtfully. The most obvious trope that was flipped on its head was Prince Charming, or lack thereof. You have two princesses, and the Prince Charming narrative is subverted with both of them. First with Elsa, where she simply doesn't have a love interest. What's so great about it is it isn't made a big deal in the story. It's not her central narrative. Her problems and desires are way beyond that. It's just a fact of the situation that she's not interested. No big deal. Then you have Anna, who is the opposite and desperately wants her Prince Charming. And she meets him with a love at first sight moment where she literally falls for him into his arms. They then have their duet with Love is an Open Door and immediately decide to get married. This whole time we're in this bubble along with Anna because we're so used to seeing this kind of story, and it then takes the other characters in the movie to burst the bubble not just for Anna but for us as well.
Marriage. I'm sorry, I'm confused. You can't marry a man you just met.
Hang on! You mean to tell me you got engaged to someone you just met that day?
And if that's not enough, they then make it a twist that he's a villain, which was pulled off really well. All of this is not only a funny, entertaining way for Disney to poke fun at itself and the tropes it has established, but also gives Anna her character arc of realizing what's important and what true love is, which all comes together near the end where they subvert yet another trope where the act of true love that solves everything isn't true love's kiss as we thought it would be, it is a sacrifice, solidifying the movie as having nothing to do with romantic love but a love between sisters. Not to keep dragging Brave, but this is how you do it. It's not just a very surface level, not like Other Girls kind of subversion, but one that actually flows well, is constantly surprising the audience, and has meaning to it beyond that. It took 12 years, but Disney Animation finally won their first Oscar for Best Animated Feature.
Frozen!
There we go.
And they earned it. The following year, they won again with Big Hero 6.
Ba-la-la-la.
Their next two releases, Zootopia and Moana, which came out in the same year, were both nominated, Zootopia winning them their third Oscar in the category. Then it came down to their next release. Disney Animation decided to make what was only their third official sequel ever out of 58 films. The first being The Rescuers Down Under, which was not a success both critically and commercially, then Fantasia 2000, which did not do well at the box office either, and now their third with Ralph Breaks the Internet. If you're wondering, hey, don't these other movies have sequels? Those were straight to home video, no theatrical release, had lower budgets, worse animation, and poor storylines. They aren't really meant to be taken as seriously as their predecessors. Lion King 2: Simba's Pride being my exception because I love that movie. I won't dive into the topic of unnecessary sequels or cash grabs because there's too much to be said. Wreck-It Ralph 2 was fine. There's a lot I liked and a lot I didn't. Mainly that it relied too heavily on viral gimmicks like the princess cameos, even though I did kinda love that scene. It lost the Oscar to a far more ambitious movie in Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, easily one of my favorite movies of the decade. And here we are, a year later, they released another sequel, Frozen 2. Before promo for it started, my thoughts were, I don't want it, we don't need it, Frozen is good enough to stand on its own. But then, the first teaser dropped. I was instantly on board. It took me by surprise. I wasn't expecting it to look so intense and dark, and I was reminded of how the first movie caught me off guard, because that was 6 years ago, and the juggernaut that Frozen turned into kind of made me forget how impressed I was with it. And I realized that there's so much potential here for this one to do the same. Unfortunately, it didn't really pan out that way. First, let me get the good stuff out the way. The visuals, incredible. I rewatched the first one after I saw this, and the animation in that one was already good, but the leap in quality between the two is very apparent. It's crazy to think what computer animation might look like 6 years from now. Second, Olaf. I love him. I know he's polarizing, but I don't care. He's hilarious, and I loved the existential crisis storyline. And 3, the story, which might come as a surprise because if I like the story and I like the animation, surely I think it deserved to be nominated. Not really. Here's what I liked. Of all the ideas I had for what the sequel could be about, colonialism was not one of them. It would have been so easy for them to have some new villain character show up at the start of the movie and write the entire sequel around that. A very basic good versus evil story. In the first one, aside from the Hans plot twist, there's no real antagonist in it. For most of it, the antagonist is kind of Elsa. Of course, not in her character, but in her actions by accident. She's the one that freezes her kingdom, and she's the one that gives Anna her frozen heart. Plot points that are usually given to the villain in the story. Another one of their many subversion. And in this one, the antagonist is in many ways the Arendelians, or at least their history. The people we are rooting for are also the people at fault in this story. And thank God there was no Pocahontas-like both sides to it. Arendelle was unequivocally at fault for this whole mess, and it was up to them to right their wrongs. The story was clunky with its magic system, a little confusing at times, and didn't flow nearly as well as its predecessor. But it definitely wasn't basic, and I liked that. At least not until the end, which is where my problems are. When I say wasted potential, I'm not asking for a massive rewrite of the movie. I think they had a really good thing going on, and it wasn't until the end that I feel like they didn't commit to what the story was setting up, and more importantly, they didn't commit to the legacy of the first movie. That you can take a prominent Disney trope, or many, and flip it on its head. As talked about earlier, in the first one, the main one I think they did that with was the Prince Charming love story. And in this one, I desperately wish that the trope they subverted was happily ever after. The most standard Disney trope of all. No matter what, when you go to one of these movies, you know that the bad guys will be defeated at the end. All problems will be solved, everything tied up in a pretty bow, and the main characters will be joyous and live happily ever after. Which is great. It is standard because it works. But with Frozen 2, it just felt like it ruined the journey for me. The rate at which every single thread and narrative was tied up at the end was just too much of a happily ever after. You had Elsa unfrozen, Anna and Elsa happily reunited, Olaf coming back to life, Kristoff successfully proposing, and Arendelle saved, all in what feels like 5 minutes.
Oh, I love happy endings.
You might think that I'm asking for too much, that this is still a kids movie, so of course it ended like this. I'm not asking for an extremely tragic end to the movie. I don't want to traumatize kids. I don't think Olaf should have stayed dead, even though I do think it would have been really gutsy for them to give him the Bing Bong treatment. It does make sense that he came back with Elsa. Subverting a happily ever after ending doesn't have to mean going in the polar opposite direction and making it a tragedy. A bittersweet ending, for example, would also be a subversion, and as talked about in the video I made for it, what it comes down to is high costs versus high rewards. The Fox and the Hound is the only Disney animation I can think of that really pulled this off. I watched this one all the time as a kid, and even though it's been a while, I still think about it very often. If you haven't seen the movie, it's about a young red fox named Todd who becomes motherless and adopted by a farmer. The farmer's neighbor gets a foxhound puppy named Copper. One day, Copper and Todd meet and become best friends. When Todd is later told that one day their friendship will turn into a rivalry, he doesn't believe them. Both Copper and Todd insist that they will be best friends forever.
And we'll always be friends forever, won't we?
Well, they grow up, a lot happens, it's really emotional, I won't get into it, but the climax of the movie is Copper and his owner hunting down Todd and his female companion Vixie. He even comes close to killing Todd, and when a bear shows up, Todd saves his former friend and falls down a waterfall. Copper approaches him, and his owner appears as well, ready to shoot the fox. Copper then positions himself in front of Todd and refuses to step aside until his owner lowers his gun. He does, and they part ways. The movie ends with Copper reminiscing about the day he first met Todd, and Todd and Vixie looking down on the homes from a hill. A happily ever after ending would be them staying true to their childhood promise that they will always be best friends forever. A tragic end would be Vixie or one of Todd or Copper dying. This is somewhere in the middle. We're never going to be best friends forever. This is a movie that didn't shy away from presenting a complicated emotional ending to children and committed to the story that it was setting up. With Frozen 2, of course you can have Elsa be unfrozen, sure bring Olaf back, and sure have Kristoff finally propose, but at the very least commit to the point of the story that Arendelle must pay to right the wrongs of their dark history.
Wrong demands to be righted.
And what better way to do that than to have the entire kingdom be washed away when the dam broke? It's not too dark for kids because there would be no loss of life. Everyone was evacuated and the kingdom was empty. Yet it would still pack an emotional punch because just imagine the image of all those families watching their home be destroyed. And you can have Anna and Elsa try and explain that this was a reckoning that needed to happen. It wouldn't just be for shock value, it would have real meaning behind it. It would also make Anna's decision to break the dam as admirable as it should be, because it would mean that she actually did sacrifice something major to do the right thing. They had already teased us with this kind of bold ending, and because of what I got from the first movie, I believed that this is where it was headed. So you can imagine my disappointment. There was not a single consequence in the end for anything. The happily ever after ending does not match the high stakes and deepest story that was being set up about accounting for your villainous history. If Arendelle is the antagonist in the story, Arendelle must be the one to pay in the end. I really think that this small change, maybe a couple more at the end, would have tied the movie together and earned them at least an Oscar nom in the category. Maybe even a win if they pulled it off well. It would have landed so much better with audiences, and the fact that this is a sequel, one which will undoubtedly have a third considering how much money it's made, was the perfect opportunity to leave audiences with something heavier than a happily ever after. And then you can return to the happily ever after format in the third movie if you want it to be left on a super positive note. I love this list of nominees mostly because it's so diverse in animation styles. It has big budget and small budget movies, both 2D and 3D animation. For Frozen 2 to earn its way here and stand out, it should not have gone this route of a happy, perfect little ending. What I'm hoping is that the omission in this category, their first movie to miss it in 7 years, will at least have them rethink and reflect in time for the next one if there is a third, to realize what made the first one so special and what could have made this one special as well. Because considering that this is now the highest grossing animated movie of all time, I think the only way to send them that message is shutting them out of this category, which is why I'm happy that was done. That's it. Thanks for watching. I hope you liked this video. Like, comment, subscribe if you did. Remember that nothing is permanent, and again, thanks for watching. Bye.
Samantha?